Dust and dreams. Dust devils danced around Dusty's scuffed boots, miniature taunts mirroring the broader devastation. The cracked earth sprawled before him, a desolate tapestry woven with fissures of despair. Above, the sun, an unforgiving eye, blazed down. Shielding his gaze was a futile act against the relentless heat, a gesture of surrender. A year absent of rain had left its mark. The creek, once the lifeblood of the ranch, was now a desiccated gash in the landscape. His remaining cattle were skeletal and apathetic, their rib cages prominent beneath taut hides. Selling off most of the herd months ago had felt like a brutal amputation, each departed animal a vanishing fragment of his heritage swallowed by the horizon. Dusty exhaled, the sound swallowed by the parched wind. He shuffled toward the water pump, a rusted monument to his grandfather's ambitions. Now, it only amplified his sense of failure. He had invested countless hours bringing it back from the brink, plugging leaks, replacing belts, coaxing meager trickles from the dwindling aquifer. But today, the pump remained stubbornly inert. He knelt, the gravelly earth grating against his skin. The engine was lifeless, beyond his capacity to revive it. He lashed out with his boot, the hollow thud echoing across the barren expanse. "Damn this land," he rasped, the words gritty on his tongue. He delved into his toolbox, a dented repository of wrenches, pliers, and decades of grime. Extracting a well-worn wrench, its handle slick from years of labor, he tightened bolts at random, recognizing the exercise as futile. The pump was as beyond salvation as his own prospects. A flicker of motion snagged his attention. A lone tumbleweed, brittle and spectral, skipped across the ravaged field, a grim omen of the desert's victory. Dusty followed its path, a cold dread settling in his gut. Memories surfaced of his father, a man etched with sun and wind, his booming laughter a constant comfort. He could almost hear him now, his voice resonating across the years. "Dusty, son," he'd say, "this land ain't just dirt. It's in our veins. It's part of who we are." They had shared countless hours repairing fences, attending to the cattle, trading stories beneath the celestial canvas. His father had imparted the wisdom of the land, teaching him to interpret its signals, to respect its force. Dusty closed his eyes, the memory sharp enough to feel the weight of his father's hand on his shoulder, the warmth of his smile. They were repairing a fence together, a flamboyant sunset painting the heavens in fiery hues. His father was recounting tales of his own father, the hardships endured during the Great Depression, the unwavering resolve required for survival. "We're tough, Dusty," his father had declared, his voice brimming with pride. "We're ranchers. Quitting isn't in our blood." But the temptation to surrender was overwhelming. The endless drought, the imperceptible trickle from the well, the evaporating savings. He had leveraged the ranch to its limit, the bank a looming specter. He could almost envision the foreclosure notice, the auctioneer's pronouncements, the final crushing blow to his family's heritage. He opened his eyes, the vision fading. The sun had dipped lower, casting elongated, gaunt shadows across the landscape. The air hung heavy, thick with the stench of dust and hopelessness. He rose, his back protesting, his limbs stiff. Weariness permeated him, a bone-deep fatigue. He trudged toward the house, a dilapidated structure showing its age. The paint peeled like sunburnt skin, the porch sagged precariously, and the roof leaked with abandon. But it was still home, his only haven. Inside, the dimness offered a brief respite from the scorching heat. He poured a glass of water from the depleted pitcher, the liquid tepid and faintly metallic. Seating himself at the scarred kitchen table, he stared out at the ravaged earth. The setting sun splashed the sky with crimson and gold, a cruel spectacle against his despair. He wondered what his father would do. He knew what he should do: liquidate the remnants of the ranch, minimize the damage, and relocate. But the notion felt like sacrilege, a betrayal of everything he treasured. His mother's parting words echoed in his mind. "Hold on to it, Dusty," she'd whispered, her voice frail but resolute. Hold on to the land. It's more than just a possession. It's your heritage, your future. He closed his eyes again, the conflicting voices warring within him. His father's voice, urging him to strength, to endurance. His mother's voice, imploring him to safeguard the land. The bank's voice, cold and impersonal, threatening dispossession. And his own voice, faint and despairing, questioning his ability to hold on much longer. He opened his eyes, a solitary tear carving a track through the grime on his cheek. He was alone, utterly alone, burdened by the weight of his family's history and the stark inevitability of his ruin. The dream of a future, populated with playing children and grazing cattle, were fading, dissolving into the all-consuming dust that choked his fields and weighed upon his spirit. He was a specter, haunting the ruins of his own existence. Storm's fury. The first heavy plops smacked the window, each a fat raindrop, a promise of relief, as yet unkept. Dusty watched, a cold dread settling in his stomach, as the sky shifted from a livid purple to a churning, charcoal void. This wasn't the gentle, soaking rain the parched earth craved. This was something malevolent. A coppery scent, a herald of ruin, rode on the wind. The gale itself was animate, shrieking around the house's edges, shaking the barn's corrugated iron roof. He imagined the herd, huddled in the lower field, their pupils dilated with terror. He cursed under his breath. He couldn't simply stand here, frozen by the ghosts of his parents, by the suffocating weight of the bank's impending foreclosure. Those creatures depended on him. They were all he had remaining. Snatching his oilskin from the door peg, he shrugged it on, the familiar aroma of aged canvas and lanolin a scant comfort. He yanked his hat low and plunged into the tempest. The storm walloped him like a fist. Rain stung his face, blurring his vision to a smeared canvas. The wind clawed at his coat, ravenous to tear it away. Jagged lightning split the heavens, painting the world in stark, fleeting strokes of luminescence, followed by a ground-shaking thunderclap that resonated through his very core. He lurched toward the barn, the mud already a treacherous, slick surface. He needed the ATV. Reaching the lower pasture on foot was impossible in this deluge. Inside the barn, the air hung heavy with the mingled scents of hay and dung. He groped for the ignition, the engine catching with a roar almost swallowed by the storm's clamor. He reversed, tires spitting mud, before gaining traction. The ride became a frantic battle for control. Gus slammed into the ATV, threatening to pitch him off. The downpour was a solid, blinding curtain that obscured everything beyond a few feet. He gripped the handlebars, knuckles bleached white, jaw set hard. He discovered the cattle bunched under the scant protection of cottonwoods, their flanks shuddering. Their cries, thin and plaintive, were swallowed by the storm's rage. Dusty knew this was a death trap. The creek, normally a trickle, now writhed and swelled, gorged with rainwater. They needed higher ground, the rocky rise near the north fence. He spurred them onward, hollering and waving his arms. They resisted, instinct urging them to cower and endure. But Dusty persisted, voice cracking, body aching with fatigue and apprehension. Slowly, arduously, he coaxed them into motion, a dark, lumbering mass against the backdrop of the tempest's fury. Another lightning flash revealed the creek, now a raging brown torrent, already breaching its banks. He had to get them across. It was the sole path to safety. He nudged the ATV into the churning water, the engine laboring against the powerful current. The water climbed rapidly, swirling around the wheels, threatening to drown the engine. He held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was nearly there when disaster struck. A wall of water, unleashed by a sudden upriver deluge, broadsided the ATV, sending it careening. He lost purchase, the vehicle spinning, the engine sputtering and dying. He was ejected, hitting the icy water with brutal force. Gasping, the frigid water stole the air from his lungs. He scrambled to his feet, the current tugging, desperate to pull him under. He scanned the scene, panic seizing him. The cattle were scattered, some floundering in the torrent, others huddled on the bank, their eyes wide with primal fear. The ATV lay half-submerged, its wheels spinning uselessly. He was marooned. The creek had transformed into a ferocious river, severing him from the high ground, from his herd, from any prospect of rescue. The storm continued its onslaught, indifferent to his struggle, its wrath unabated. He was isolated, at the mercy of the elements, facing the very real possibility of succumbing to the rising waters that threatened to engulf his land, his heritage, and perhaps his very existence. A bride adrift. The wind clawed at Dusty, tearing at his soaked poncho like a hungry beast. Every muscle screamed in protest as he pulled himself further up the slope, the slick mud offering no purchase. The relentless rain blurred the world into a gray, churning canvas. He had to find some kind of shelter, not just for himself, but if any of the herd had made it this far. He rounded a large outcropping of rock, its jagged face offering a sliver of respite from the wind. It was there, nestled in the meager shelter, that he saw her. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a phantom born of exhaustion and fear. A crumpled heap of white against the gray, unyielding stone. He squinted, wiped the rain from his eyes with a mud-caked hand, and took another hesitant step. It was a person. He approached cautiously, his boots squelching in the mud. "Hello," he called out, his voice barely audible above the storm's roar. "Are you all right?" The figure didn't respond. Dusty drew closer, his heart pounding against his ribs. He could now make out the details. A woman, young, huddled in a sodden, white dress. A wedding dress. He knelt beside her, the cold seeping through his jeans. "Mom, can you hear me?" He reached out a hesitant hand and gently shook her shoulder. She flinched a small, sharp movement and then slowly lifted her head. Her face was pale, streaked with dirt and tears. Her eyes, wide and dark, held a mixture of fear and exhaustion. She looked like a startled fawn, ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. Who are you?" Her voice was a bare whisper, trembling with cold. "My name is Dusty," he said, keeping his voice low and calm. "I'm just trying to get out of this storm. Are you hurt?" She shook her head, her gaze darting around as if she expected someone to jump out from behind the rocks. I just need a rest." Dusty frowned. "This isn't a place to rest. You'll freeze to death out here. Look, I know a small cabin further up the ridge. It's not much, but it's dry. You need to get out of those wet clothes." She pulled her knees tighter to her chest, her white dress a stark contrast to the muddy ground. "No, I can't." "Can't what?" "Can't get warm. Can't save yourself." Dusty was losing patience. He was cold, tired, and worried about his cattle. He didn't have time for this. "Look, I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to help." She stared at him, her eyes searching his face. He met her gaze, trying to convey sincerity, a promise of safety. He wasn't sure how successful he was. He was a sight himself. Finally, she spoke, her voice still barely audible. "He'll find me." "Who will find you?" Dusty asked gently. She didn't answer, just shook her head again, her eyes filling with fresh tears. The wind howled around them, a mournful cry that seemed to echo her despair. Dusty sighed. He couldn't just leave her here. Not in this storm. "Look," he said, "I don't know what you're running from, and, frankly, it's none of my business. But you're going to die out here if you don't get some shelter. Just come with me to the cabin. If you still want to leave in the morning, you can. I won't stop you." He stood up, offering her his hand. She hesitated, her gaze fixed on his outstretched hand, as if it were a venomous snake. Rain plastered her dark hair to her face, and her shivering grew more pronounced. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please, just help me." That was all it took. Dusty pulled her to her feet, surprised by how light she was. She swayed slightly, and he steadied her. Her skin was clammy and cold. "Come on," he said, putting his arm around her shoulders. "Let's get you inside." He started to lead her up the slope, each step a struggle against the wind and the mud. She stumbled beside him, leaning heavily on his arm. He glanced at her face. Despite the dirt and the tears, he could see she was beautiful. An odd thought, considering the circumstances. As they made their way towards the cabin, Dusty couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stumbled into something far more complicated than a simple rescue. This woman, this runaway bride, was a mystery wrapped in a white dress, adrift in the storm. And he, against his better judgment, had just pulled her aboard. Shelter and stories. The farmhouse was no palace, but it was dry. Dusty ushered Clara inside, the wind howling a mournful protest as he slammed the door shut against the storm. The interior was dim, lit only by a couple of kerosene lamps, casting long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The air smelled of wood smoke and something faintly metallic like old tools. "It's not much," he said, gesturing around the main room, which served as kitchen, dining, and living area. A worn Navajo rug lay before the stone fireplace, the only splash of color in the otherwise muted tones of the room. "But it's solid." Clara, still shivering, just nodded, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. The elaborate wedding dress seemed ridiculously out of place amidst the rustic simplicity. "First things first," Dusty said, heading towards a wooden chest in the corner. "Get you out of those wet clothes. I think I've got something that might fit." He rummaged inside, pulling out a thick, woolen sweater and a pair of worn denim overalls. Probably a bit big, but better than freezing. Clara accepted the clothes with a grateful smile, her teeth still chattering slightly. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the warm fabric to her chest. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't found me." Dusty just grunted in response, busying himself with lighting a fire in the hearth. The flames crackled to life, casting a warm glow throughout the room. "Bathroom's through there," he said, pointing to a small door tucked away in a corner. "Towels are on the rack." While Clara changed, Dusty put a pot of water on the stove to boil. He rummaged through his pantry, pulling out a can of beans and a loaf of day-old bread. Not exactly a feast, but it would have to do. Clara emerged from the bathroom a few minutes later, looking slightly less like a drowned rat. The oversized sweater swallowed her whole, and the overalls were rolled up at the cuffs, but she seemed warmer, more relaxed. She'd managed to braid her hair loosely, and some color had returned to her cheeks. "Thank you," she said again, her voice stronger this time. "This is much better." "Don't mention it," Dusty replied, pouring the boiling water into a chipped enamel mug and adding a spoonful of instant coffee. He handed it to her. "Here, this will help." They sat in silence for a few minutes, Clara sipping her coffee and Dusty stirring the beans in the pot. The only sound was the crackling fire and the relentless drumming of the rain against the roof. Finally, Dusty broke the silence. "So," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "you want to tell me what a bride was doing running through a storm in the middle of nowhere?" Clara hesitated, her gaze fixed on the swirling steam rising from her mug. She took a deep breath. "It's complicated." "I figured," Dusty said drily. "Most things are." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. "My wedding wasn't my choice." Dusty raised an eyebrow. "Arranged marriage?" Clara nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "My father, he needed the money. The man I was supposed to marry. He's wealthy, powerful. He could save our family's business. And you didn't want to be saved that way." "No," Clara said fiercely. "I couldn't. I can't be bought and sold like property. I'd rather be a runaway bride, penniless in a storm, than live a lifetime in a gilded cage." She shuddered, remembering the cold, assessing look in her intended husband's eyes. He saw not a woman, but a transaction. Dusty watched her, his expression unreadable. He knew a thing or two about being trapped by circumstances, about making choices you didn't want to make. He understood the desperation in her voice, the fierce determination in her eyes. He ladled the beans into 2 bowls and cut thick slices of bread. "Eat," he said, pushing a bowl towards her. "You need your strength." As they ate in silence, the storm raged on outside, a wild symphony of wind and rain. Inside the small farmhouse, however, a fragile sense of peace had settled, a shared understanding between two strangers brought together by fate and a runaway bride's desperate flight for freedom. Desperate measures. The morning dawned with the sky scrubbed clean, a deceptive calm that mocked the devastation left behind. Dusty found Clara sitting on the porch swing, wrapped in one of his warm wool blankets, staring out at the fields. The sun painted her face in hues of gold and amber, highlighting the worry etched there. He poured 2 mugs of coffee, the bitter aroma cutting through the morning air. "Figured you could use this," he said, handing her one. She took it with a grateful nod, her eyes meeting his briefly. "Thank you, Dusty." They sat in silence for a long while, the only sound the creaking of the swing and the distant call of a meadowlark. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "What will you do now? With the ranch, I mean." Dusty sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. "Don't know. Bank's breathing down my neck. Drought's been bleeding me dry for 2 years, and this storm just about finished the job. Insurance won't cover half of it." He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. "Might have to sell. Let go to some city slicker who'll turn it into a damn golf course." The thought tasted like ash in his mouth. Clara watched him, her gaze intense. "This place, it means a lot to you, doesn't it?" "It's everything," he admitted, the words raw with emotion. "My grandfather built this place. My father, too. It's in my blood. Losing it, it'd be like losing a part of myself." She nodded, understanding flickering in her eyes. "I think I understand that feeling." She took a deep breath. "My father, he arranged a marriage for me, with a man I've never met, a man old enough to be my grandfather." Dusty frowned, the line of his jaw tightening. "Arranged marriage? That still happens." "It does when your father sees you as nothing more than a bargaining chip, a way to secure a business deal." Her voice was laced with bitterness. "He didn't care about my happiness, my dreams, only about the prestige and the money." She looked away, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I tried to tell him, to make him understand, but he wouldn't listen. Said it was my duty, that I was being selfish." Dusty felt a surge of anger on her behalf, a protectiveness he hadn't expected. He knew what it was like to have your choices taken away from you, to feel trapped by circumstances beyond your control. "So you ran." "I ran," she confirmed, her voice regaining a measure of strength. "I couldn't face a lifetime of misery, of being someone's possession. I'd rather face the storm than that." Another long silence stretched between them, this one different, filled with a shared understanding. Then Clara turned to him, her eyes bright with a sudden spark of hope. "Dusty," she said, her voice earnest. Maybe we can help each other." He raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "How's that?" "My father," she began, hesitating for a moment. "He's a powerful man. He'll be looking for me. He'll use every resource he has to find me and drag me back." Dusty nodded slowly, understanding dawning. "You need a place to disappear, somewhere he wouldn't think to look." "Exactly," she said. "And you need to save your ranch. You need money." He leaned forward, his gaze locking with hers. "What are you suggesting?" Clara took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "A marriage of convenience. You protect me from my father, give me a place to hide. And my family has money. I could access some. Enough to pay off the bank, to repair the ranch." The idea hung in the air, audacious and desperate. Dusty considered it, weighing the risks and the rewards. It was crazy, insane even. But what other choice did they have? He was on the verge of losing everything, and she was facing a life sentence of unhappiness. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw not just a runaway bride, but a woman of strength and determination, a woman willing to risk everything for her freedom. And he saw, perhaps, a way out of his own despair. "It's a big ask, Clara," he said, his voice low. "I know," she replied, her eyes pleading. "But what other options do we have, Dusty? We're both desperate." He looked out at his damaged land, at the fields that had sustained his family for generations. He looked back at Clara, at the hope and desperation in her eyes. "All right," he said, his voice firm, "I'm in." A faint smile touched Clara's lips. "Then we have a deal, a proposal at dawn." A weak, spectral light crept over the horizon, limning the scarred land in hues of slate and violet. The air, redolent with damp earth and pine, pressed heavily against Dusty's chest. He stood on the porch, the aged planks protesting beneath him, taking stock of the desolation. A lifetime's toil, diminished by protracted aridity, now all but eradicated by a singular act of nature. A faint stir came from behind. Clara was framed in the doorway, swathed in a quilt of his mother's making, her expression pale yet firm. Lamplight flickered in her irises, lending her an almost unearthly beauty. "Dusty," she began, her voice a fragile thread against the wind's lament. "About last night," he steeled himself. The proposition was inevitable. He'd glimpsed the calculation, a mirrored desperation, in her gaze. "I meant what I said," she went on, meeting his eyes. "About helping you salvage the ranch." A slow nod, the enormity of his situation a palpable weight. "And you believe a marriage is the answer?" Clara drew nearer, the aroma of lavender emanating from the quilt. "It's the only solution I see. My father commands considerable influence. Were I simply to vanish, he'd pursue me relentlessly. But matrimony, that's different. It offers me sanctuary, and it provides you an opening." He raked a hand through his already unruly hair. An opening. That's all he craved, a chance to safeguard his inheritance. But at what forfeiture? "What sort of arrangement are we discussing, Clara?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "A legally binding one, at least outwardly. We'd present a united front. To the world, we'd be spouses. What transpires privately remains our prerogative." A delicate rose tinted her cheeks. Dusty averted his gaze towards the ravaged fields. He could almost hear his father's voice, edged with disappointment, cautioning against expedient solutions, against sacrificing principle. The ranch was more than soil and timber. It was a birthright, a testament to effort and integrity. Could he defile that with a charade? "My father would undoubtedly furnish a substantial settlement to guarantee my contentment," Clara continued, piercing the silence. "Sufficient to extinguish your debts, repair the destruction, and even invest in modern irrigation methods." The words lingered, shimmering with the hope of redemption. Irrigation, a prospect he dared not entertain. He'd been so consumed with mere survival, with averting complete ruin, he'd forgotten how to dream. "And what do you gain from this, Clara?" he inquired, pivoting back to face her. "Beyond refuge from your father?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the weathered porch floor. "Autonomy," she stated at last, her voice barely audible. "The freedom to forge my own destiny, to exercise agency. Something forever denied to me." He recognized the stark vulnerability in her expression, a mirror image of his own despair. Two souls teetering on the precipice, grasping for support amidst the debris of their lives. "I don't know, Clara," he confessed, shaking his head. "It feels dishonest, duplicitous." "What is more dishonest, Dusty?" she retorted, her voice gaining strength. "Entering into a loveless union, living a life dictated by another, or striking a bargain to rescue ourselves, to cultivate something genuine from the wreckage?" He remained mute, grappling with his inner turmoil. The memory of his mother surfaced, her gentle smile, her unwavering faith in righteousness. Then his father appeared, his work-worn hands, his steadfast devotion to the land. What path would they have chosen? "Consider the proposition," Clara whispered, retreating back into the house. "Dawn is upon us, Dusty. Time is fleeting." He watched her vanish indoors, leaving him alone with the nascent sun and the burden of his decision. The tempest had subsided, yet a fresh conflict raged within him, a battle between fealty and aspiration, between virtue and endurance. He had to decide, and with dispatch. The destiny of his family's heritage, and perhaps Clara's future, rested entirely on his shoulders. Before sunrise, the first rays of dawn threatened to paint the eastern sky, but Dusty wasn't watching. He was too busy wrestling with the buckle of his best belt, the leather stiff from disuse. Beside him, Clara fidgeted, the pearl buttons of her borrowed blouse gleaming faintly in the pre-dawn gloom. "Are you sure about this, Dusty?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He knew she wasn't asking about their location. He paused, his fingers still fumbling with the buckle. The truth was a knot in his gut, a cold, hard certainty that tasted like dust and desperation. "No," he admitted, meeting her gaze. "But I'm even less sure about losing everything." She nodded, a small, understanding movement. "Then let's get this over with." Finding the preacher had been a stroke of luck, a desperate prayer answered in the form of a beat-up Ford pickup parked outside the general store. Reverend Eli, a man whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles etched by sun and scripture, had agreed, after some initial hesitation and a long, searching look at them both. Dusty had offered him $20, all the cash he had on hand. Now, standing in the lee of the barn, the chill morning air nipping at their exposed skin, Reverend Eli cleared his throat. His Bible, worn and dog-eared, was clutched in his hand. The only light came from the sliver of moon still clinging to the western horizon. "We are gathered here this morning," Reverend Eli began, his voice surprisingly strong for such a small man, "to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." He glanced at Dusty, then at Clara. "Do you both come here freely and without reservation to enter into this union?" Dusty swallowed. "Edo." The words felt foreign, a clumsy lie on his tongue. He risked a glance at Clara, her face pale but resolute. "I do," she echoed, her voice firmer than he expected. Reverend Eli proceeded with the ceremony, the familiar words echoing in the stillness. Dusty barely registered them, his mind a whirlwind of cattle prices, overdue bank loans, and the nagging image of his father's disappointment. He kept expecting a thunderbolt to strike them down for the sheer audacity of their charade. He felt Clara's hand slip into his, her fingers surprisingly warm. He squeezed gently, a silent acknowledgement of their shared predicament. Her skin was soft, unfamiliar. He suddenly realized he barely knew her. "Dusty, do you take Clara to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part?" He hesitated, the weight of the vows pressing down on him. Love and cherish? He barely knew the woman. But the ranch, his family. "I do," he said, the words catching in his throat. Clara's vows followed, spoken with a quiet dignity that surprised him. He wondered what she was thinking, what ghost she was running from. He only knew she was as trapped as he was. "By the power vested in me," Reverend Eli declared, his voice resonating in the cool air, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." He looked at Dusty expectantly. "You may kiss the bride." Dusty turned to Clara, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Her eyes, wide and uncertain, met his. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. It was a chaste, hesitant kiss, a fleeting touch that held no passion, only a shared sense of obligation. When they broke apart, the eastern sky was beginning to blaze with color, painting the landscape in hues of orange and pink. The sunrise felt like a judgment, a harsh light revealing the stark reality of their situation. Reverend Eli smiled, a weary but genuine expression. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Kincaid. May God bless this union." He accepted Dusty's crumpled bills with a nod and headed back to his truck. Dusty watched him go, a hollow feeling in his chest. He was married. He had a wife. And the ranch, well, the ranch still needed saving. He turned to Clara, her face illuminated by the rising sun. "So," he said, the words sounding flat and empty in the morning air. "Now what?" Clara took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs. She lifted her chin, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "Now," she said, "we save your ranch." The father's fury. The approaching disturbance wasn't the familiar breath of an incoming storm. It possessed a directed energy, a rising tempest of earth signaling intention. Before she could distinguish vehicles, Clara recognized the deep-throated growl, her father. She clutched the porch railing, the aged wood biting into her skin. Dusty, attuned to her sudden tension, rested a hand on her shoulder. Problems brewing? Clara could only nod, her throat constricted. He's here. Dusty's gaze sharpened. A phalanx of obsidian SUVs, reflecting the afternoon sun like malevolent eyes, surged up the lane, their passage churning the dry earth into a swirling vortex that powdered the freshly mended fence. The lead vehicle shrieked to a halt before the porch, its dark windows impenetrable. Reginald Thornton unfolded himself from the interior, a colossus in a Seville rose suit that seemed jarringly out of place against the ranch's humble facade. His features, typically arranged in an expression of icy control, were now twisted with undisguised fury. "Clara," he thundered, his voice a shockwave across the yard. "What in God's name have you done?" Clara advanced, gently disengaging from Dusty's touch. "I made my decision, father." "A decision?" "To abscond like some common." He sputtered, hunting for the right barb. His eyes flicked to Dusty, dismissing him with a chilling disdain. "And to marry him?" Dusty's jaw hardened. He moved to Clara's side, his stance firm on the weathered planks. "Clara is my wife, Mr. Thornton, and this is our home." Reginald's gaze narrowed to slits. "This shack? You've traded a life of ease and security for this desolate patch, and some rancher." The word dripped with scorn. "It's not a shack, and he's more than just a rancher," Clara countered, her voice gaining strength. "This is where I belong now, and Dusty is my husband. I love him." The declaration hung suspended, vulnerable before the storm of her father's disapproval. A flush crept up Reginald's neck. "Love? You barely know the man. This is lunacy, Clara. Absolute lunacy. You're coming home with me. Now." He swept his hand towards the waiting SUV. "No," Clara stated, her voice unwavering. "I will not." Reginald closed the distance between them, his imposing frame casting a long shadow. "Don't be absurd. This passing fancy will fade. You're simply disoriented. You need to regain your senses." He reached for her arm. Dusty moved, intercepting him. She said, "No, Mr. Thornton. You need to respect that." His tone was quiet, but resolute, a core of steel beneath the calm that gave Reginald pause. "Get out of my way, son," Reginald spat. "This is a family matter." "She is my family now," Dusty returned, his gaze locked on the older man. "And you're trespassing. Treat my wife with respect, or get off my land." Reginald barked a harsh laugh. "You think you can stop me? I could acquire this backwater and everything on it without breaking a sweat. I could obliterate you." "Maybe," Dusty conceded, unflinching. "But you can't buy what Clara's found here. She's found contentment. She's found meaning. And she's found someone who cherishes her for herself, not for her connections." Tears glistened in Clara's eyes. She reached for Dusty's hand, entwining their fingers. The simple act communicated volumes. Reginald stared at their joined hands, disbelief etched on his face. "You're resolute about this." "Absolutely resolute," Clara confirmed. "I'm not returning, father. This is my life. If you can't accept it, then there's nothing left to say." Silence descended, thick and oppressive. The only sound was the lonely groan of the wind pump in the distance. Reginald's chest rose and fell as he fought to contain his fury. At last he spoke, his voice a low rumble of thunder. "You'll rue this, Clara. You'll come crawling back. And when you do, don't anticipate a welcome." He spun on his heel and stalked back to the vehicle. His security detail, looking distinctly uneasy, hurried to follow. The SUVs roared to life, executed sharp turns, and tore back down the lane, leaving behind a choking cloud of dust and a residue of foreboding. Clara sagged against Dusty, her body trembling slightly. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I didn't want to drag this mess to your door." Dusty enfolded her in his arms, drawing her close. "You didn't bring it, Clara. It was always lurking, just beyond the horizon. We'll meet it together." He watched the diminishing dust cloud, his eyes narrowing. "We always do. Hope's embrace." The dust plume from Reginald's departure lingered, dissipating like smoke after a skirmish. Clara sought solace against Dusty's solid frame, his warmth a welcome shield against the lingering frost of her father's visit. He circled an arm around her shoulders, his gaze tracking the deserted road. "He'll be back," Dusty stated, his tone resolute, not questioning. Clara simply nodded, a cold dread settling in her stomach. "I know." They remained like that, the hush punctuated only by a distant meadowlark song. At length, Dusty prompted her with a gentle nudge. "Come on, work awaits." The following weeks blurred into a whirlwind of activity. Fences were repaired, thickets cleared, and the land tended with newfound purpose. Then, without announcement, Reginald reappeared. This time, he didn't erupt from his car. Instead, he stood silently by the corral, observing Dusty patiently guide Clara through the process of saddling a horse. Sunlight illuminated swirling particles, turning them into fleeting sparks of gold. He watched their easy rapport, the instinctive way Dusty's hand supported Clara's back when she faltered, the genuine laughter that erupted when she finally secured the girth. He witnessed not a contrived arrangement, but a burgeoning partnership, a blossoming affection. A self-conscious cough broke the silence. Dusty's expression hardened, and Clara instinctively reached for Dusty's hand. I've been giving this some thought," Reginald began, his usual bombast absent. He seemed diminished, the sharp lines of his bespoke suit muted by the harsh light. "I still don't condone this." He gestured vaguely between them. "However, I see something is different." He paused, searching for the right phrasing. "I'm prepared to offer a proposition, Thornton. Alone, enough to stabilize the ranch." Dusty's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "What strings are attached?" Reginald exhaled, the sound weighted with resignation. "Here's the stipulation: 1 year. A year to demonstrate the ranch's viability. A year to prove your ability to provide for my daughter. Failure means Clara returns home." Clara gasped, gripping Dusty's hand tighter. "Father, you can't." Reginald silenced her with a raised palm. "The choice is his, Clara. He can refuse." Dusty's gaze shifted between Reginald and Clara, thoughts racing. This was a potential salvation, a lifeline he couldn't easily dismiss. But the prospect of Clara being forced back into that gilded cage haunted him. "I accept," he stated firmly. Reginald gave a curt nod, a spark of something akin to hope flickering in his gaze. "Good. I'll have the documents prepared. Don't anticipate further concessions." With that, he turned and walked back to his car, the dust swirling around his departing form. The loan offered by Reginald was a boon, yet it carried a crushing burden of expectation. Dusty and Clara absorbed themselves in books, studying innovative farming methods, trialing new crops, and investigating enhanced irrigation. They discovered the principles of crop rotation and soil preservation, experimenting with drought-resistant varieties and advanced water conservation strategies. Clara surprisingly blossomed. Possessing an aptitude for numbers, she swiftly mastered the ranch's accounts, optimizing expenditure and identifying opportunities for growth. She negotiated improved terms with suppliers and uncovered new markets for their yields. The pampered debutante had vanished. A capable rancher's wife had taken her place, resourceful and resolute. In return, Dusty developed a profound respect for Clara's intellect and fortitude. He taught her horsemanship, the art of roping, and how to decipher nature's signals. He witnessed her evolution from a city dweller into a woman of the land, her hands roughened but strong, her spirit unbroken. Side by side, they labored, their initial agreement evolving into something far richer. They shared meals beneath the vast starlit canopy, their conversations stretching late into the night. They laughed, they debated, they offered solace during trials and celebrated each small triumph. The ranch, previously teetering on the precipice of ruin, began to thrive. The fields, once parched and barren, burst forth with vibrant life. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the setting sun paint the firmament in fiery hues, Dusty turned to Clara, his eyes reflecting a warmth she'd never perceived before. "Clara," He began, his voice thick with emotion. This began as a transaction, but it's transformed into something far greater. I never imagined I could. He hesitated, searching for the precise expression. I never imagined I could love again. Clara's spirit lifted. She reached out and clasped his hand, their fingers intertwined. Neither did I, Dusty. But you revealed to me the meaning of true freedom, of authentic living. He drew her nearer, his gaze meeting hers. Then let's not delay any further, he breathed, and kissed her, a kiss both tender and fervent, a kiss that sealed their bond and their dedication to one another. The land seemed to sigh contentedly, the parched earth absorbing the promise of a future nurtured by hope and sustained by love.